Welcome to the Big Woods Bucks podcast. I'm your host, Hal Blood. Sitting here with my co-host, Lee Shands. And today we're going to talk a little bit about our parents, fathers' influence, and how they've helped us grow as guys, but tying it in with the hunting and stuff that when they would take us hunting when we were younger, and how it's important to get the kids out and how much difference it makes. So anyways, we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to let Lee get started with his father.
Yeah, it was a good hunting season for me. My clients got deer, and I shot a nice buck in November, but my dad passed away on Veterans Day in November, and which is kind of ironic because the only reason why my dad wasn't a veteran because my mom had me. My dad graduated high school in 65, and my mom had me in 66. So they got married, and so my dad's draft number just never came up. His brother that was a year younger than him ended up in Nam, but my dad didn't end up going. And so I just wanted to do a podcast on my father and his influence on me. I've told a lot of people that my parents were just kids when they had me, and my mom was 16 and my dad was 19, and they made plenty of mistakes like kids would, but they stuck it out. They stayed married and, had a good marriage for, close to 60 years, and, raised me and my sister and I have a wonderful relationship. So they made some mistakes early, but made up for it later in life. And the main thing that I wanted to touch on was all the job skills. My dad was always a hard worker, and my mother too, but all the job skills that they taught me and prepared me for life. And that's a big thing. I think that's kind of lost in society now.
Oh, a lot of people have forgot that their job as a parent is to prepare their kids for life.
Right.
Their job isn't to be their best friend and coddle them and cater to them, because that doesn't prepare them, right?
Right.
But it seems to be nowadays in society, parents think that's the role of them. And they call it, back when we were kids, tough love,
Right.
We got a lot of tough love,
Yeah.
But went a long way for both of us, really,
Yeah, when we had my dad's funeral, I was back in my hometown where I grew up, and the church was full, and there was a ton of people there, and I just told people that my dad was the right guy for the job, because I didn't know it at the time. I was like 13 years old, and we got this whole good Lee and bad Lee thing in Big Woods Bucks, with bad Lee Libby, but I'll tell you, my dad was the original bad Lee. Libby had nothing on my old man when he was younger. He liked to drink, and he wasn't afraid to throw punches. So that's the household that I grew up in. But when I got up in my teen years, I didn't realize it, but my parents were having a few struggles, and I'd get kicked out of school. That's hard to believe, but good Lee got kicked out of school for a while for being bad Lee. And I think it was a wake-up call. My parents were probably around 30, early 30s when all that happened, but they were growing up, and they just made some changes. And my dad had always, even when he was younger and wilder, he did, unlike some of his buddies, if my dad went on a fishing trip or a hunting trip, he took me. I always appreciated that. And I look back now, 1975 was my introduction to the Big Woods. I remember we left Farmington area where I grew up, and we went up to the Enchanted Road, which back then was wild country.
Oh yeah.
It took an hour. It took an hour to get from Farmington to the end of the Enchanted Road, and then it would take you an hour to get from 201 into Enchanted Stream. You can do it in 5 minutes now with your BMW if you want to, but back then it was just two-wheel ruts.
Yeah.
And I remember coming up by the Kennebec River in 75, and it was full of pulpwood. We came up it was in May. I think we went up Memorial Weekend, and the whole, Wyman Lake and the whole length of the Kennebec was right full of pulpwood.
Yeah.
And so I got to see that. I mean, that was part of history. I think 75 or 6 was the last year that they
I got a picture.
floated it
We were
down.
going up fishing because I used to go above town. And I think my first trip up there fishing with the relatives of my father was 73 because I was 16, I think. And then I'd gone up with my father and a couple of cousins or something, and I think it was 76 because I think I'd come home. It was when I was in the Marine Corps, and it was, I think, that next summer. And I snapped a picture. Back then we just had them little cheap cameras, and I snapped a picture of Wyman with all full of logs. I still have that picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those guys were athletes. There's a guy that he still lives in Skowhegan area. He's in his 80s, and he was a log driver. He's one of them tall, lanky guys. And he said, them log drivers, the guys that were actually on the logs jumping back and forth, he said you had to be an athlete. You had to be really quick, agile, and those guys were really something. I've watched videos on them, and boy, that was a dangerous job. They paid them good money, but in the springtime when the water was high and there was still ice in the river, that was all kinds of dangerous.
Yeah. They didn't have workman's comp back then either.
No, no. So in 75, this is a funny story. So the reason why we went up there was my uncle lived in, or it would have been my dad's uncle, been my great uncle. He lived in Caratunk. And at the time, they plowed 201 with a grader. And that was his job, was he plowed from Caratunk down to Bingham, I think, with the grader. And they had a camp up. The reason why we went into Enchanted, it's still there. Nobody knows it's there because it's on the backside of Lower Enchanted. But the McAllister family, they still have a camp there on the backside of Lower Enchanted. And I'd heard all of these stories when my dad was a kid. That was his first experience with the big woods too, was they would drive in there. And at the time, that was before, there was a few logging roads in there, but that was really wild country in the 50s. And it was kind of like, it reminded me of when you and I first went to Ontario. There wasn't a lot of logging there, so you had to find the openings in the forest, like around the beaver bogs or those natural meadows and stuff. But my dad's uncle, he always carried a belt axe with him, and they had trails that went to all the streams and all the little beaver bogs, and then there were small ponds there, and he had trails, and he was always marking the trees with that belt axe and lemon, to keep trails open. So you might go to what they called the second bog or the third bog, and they'd have the kids would sit on the edge of those bogs and, watch for deer. And it was, you could almost, like when my dad would tell me these stories, you could smell the wood smoke and the Hoppies number 9, and they would have, they ate beans all the time, those guys back then. You had beans with your eggs for breakfast, and you had beans at night they were always shooting partridge. A lot of them, they'd either have like a .22 pistol or, something that they would shoot birds with, so they always were eating birds. But
so you could smell bean farts and Hoppies.
Yeah, quite a combination, and hope that the two didn't mix. But my dad, he told me, and I actually have that gun now, his first gun was a 30-30 Marlin. And it's in pretty rough shape, but my dad bought it for cheap money when he was a kid, and that's what he had. And my grandfather had a 30-40 Craig, which was a pretty popular gun back then because you could buy them through mail order catalogs like Sears and Roebuck and stuff for next to nothing. Yeah. So he had a 30-40 Craig that he cut down and sporterized, and it had a Redfield receiver sight on it. He done that, and then my uncle had a 98 Mauser. It was an 8mm. He did the same thing. He sporterized it and put a peep sight on it, and that's what those guys hunted with. And just, I'd heard all of those stories, but never seen Enchanted. So when I was 9, we went on that trip. And some people will be able to figure out, I'm not going to actually name the name of the pond, but there's a little small pond that even today, you have to hike into it. But back then, we would drive as close as we could to Enchanted Stream, and then we would cross at what they call the second set of falls, and my uncle had a trail in the woods that went up to this little pond. And the first year that we went in there, we packed everything in, every one of us. My father and my uncles were rugged boys, all of them, so they carried most of the weight, but me and my cousin and my grandfather, we we all had, knapsacks on, and we carried all of our food in there. And when we got in there, we built a raft out of cedar logs. Somebody had brought a bow saw, and so we made a raft out of cedar logs and went out on this raft, and we caught a few. They were beautiful trout. The trout in there were those dark brown trout, with the red spots. So during the day, it was pretty bright and sunny. We caught a few trout, but the pond was only like 6 feet deep at the deepest point. So you didn't catch much during the day. But then at night, my grandfather would stay at the campsite with me and my cousin, and, we'd toast marshmallows or wieners or whatever. And my father and my uncles went out on the raft. Well, my dad caught a 19-inch brook trout, and one of my uncles caught a 22-inch brook trout. And then they caught a bunch of them that were like 16 to 18 inches. We never weighed them, but I bet that 22-inch brook trout, it was probably at least a 5-pound brook trout. I mean, it was a big fish. So it was worth it, the hike in there. But my dad, because we were packing everything in, we brought one sleeping bag for both of us to share. Well, my dad's 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, and sharing that sleeping bag wasn't a very good idea because it was so warm, if you tried to put the sleeping bag over your head, we were both suffocating. But if you took it off, those minges were just, it was like fire, So we didn't get a lot of sleep, but I was young, so it didn't matter. And my father was probably drunk, so he probably didn't feel it. But anyway, that first year, the fishing was just wonderful. So in 76, we went back up again thinking it was going to be great. Well, what happened was that I think we had like an open winter that year, but I know it was like really, really cold. And what they figured was that pond froze up so much that they had to die off, because we went up there and camped for a couple days and never even had a bite, never caught a fish. So we hiked back down to the second set of falls, and we didn't even bring tents with us. We brought a couple of tarps, and we'd tie something for poles up in the trees and then put the tarps up and, slept out under the open. And so we went back to the second set of falls on Enchanted and fished that. And in 1976, Enchanted Stream was so infested with trout, it was like smelts. I mean, if you threw your worm out, there was 20 fish rushing to get to it.
Like piranha.
Oh, it was incredible. Yeah, really nice.
Here's a few words about our sponsors. Make sure you support these guys. They're all top notch, and they keep Big Woods Bucks going. Thank you.
Being the low-tech guy I am, there's one thing I've learned to embrace with technology, and it's my Onyx. I used to carry maps and GPS when it finally came out and stuff, but the Onyx has eliminated that because I've got my GPS in my phone now with my Onyx app. I can mark everything in that. It's helpful that I can show other people by putting a pin in if I want to send somebody to a place. Being a guide, that's important, I can give them the pin, put it in there, I text it to them, whatever. So if you want to get your Onyx, get your Big Woods Bucks code, BWB, and get you 20% off, but I highly recommend it. Give you a little update. Skinner Sights. We all know they're the best site going, but it's a great company because Andy and the crew there are innovative, and they're always thinking up either new models to make a site for, improve the sites, making mounts for scopes, and now they've come on with their own line of scopes and red dots. Whatever Andy does in the company, it's top-notch, first quality, and they stand behind everything, and we're glad to have them as a partner, and we hope you'll try their sites, and you can trust your life with those, and they're going to get you the game. So get your Skinner Sights, and you can trust me that you're going to be glad you did. Just wanted to talk a little bit about minus 33 in the wool they have, which I believe is best wool going, whether it's base layers or your socks or whatever you're wearing. You got to have wool. I've been stressing that for people for years, to wear your wool, whether it's the outerwear or even your base layers and socks. I've been to the tour of the plant, see how they make their socks, and it's quality, the fit is right, and they're going to be long lasting. I've got socks I've had now for several years, and they look like I'll have them for several years more before they even think about wearing out. So I trust my life to wool, and you can too. Minus 33.
All right, back to the podcast.
Yeah, the same thing happened to me when we went in, and it was like that for quite a few years where we fished up north of town there. My father's cousins had learned of that like years before, and they'd been going a long time. And the same thing, there was only a couple of roads, and they hiked into all them ponds, and the fishing was fabulous. I remember back then it was a pond called Ironbound. It's still there, and the fishing's nothing like it was then, but we would go in there, and like you said, to get in, we'd get to Jackman, and they'd all gas up in town, and we'd go Memorial Weekend, and so it was Friday night, and we were driving in. Darkness would overcome us, but it probably took us, and it was just over 13 miles in from town, up start in on the Moose River Road and stuff, but we'd be 2 or 3 hours going there, throwing rocks and logs in the mud holes in the roads, but the same thing. And then to get to this one pond, it was always washed out. It never was much of a road. I think it wasn't much more than, it was more than a winter road because it did have gravel in it, but they never maintained it. And I remember it would take us from where we camped to get to Ironbound. We'd fish that the first day. Every year we went the first morning, we'd get up and have breakfast, and we was going to Ironbound. And there was always about probably 8 of us, 8 or 10, and I was the kid. I was the only kid. My father and his cousins and uncles. But to get to that Ironbound, I think it was probably 4 miles, maybe 3-4 miles. It wasn't very far. And it would be almost noon before we got there.
Jumping from boulder to boulder.
Yeah, and then his cousins had Blazers, and then his uncle had one of them old International Scout all-wheel drive things that went good. They were low, but they'd pull, That thing, my father's cousin would pound that up the hills and throw a strap down and pull them Blazers up the hills, it'd be ruts 3 feet deep. And then we'd get in. It was like an adventure for me, you know what I mean? I was like, I'd never seen nothing like that. And but we'd get in there. They all had the canoes on the roofs, and we'd have a limit in about an hour. Back then, you could keep 10 trout.
Right.
And in an hour, we had 80 trout and headed back out. And there was so many, we just never got any big ones. And all around that was a beautiful pond, clear water, and it had a gravel bar in the middle. And it wasn't very big. It was kind of long, but there was a lot of trees over the years had blown down, cedars or spruce. And under every one of them blown down trees, you'd catch half a dozen or 10 trout there. You'd start casting, then you just move down to the next one, and then you'd have your limit.
Yeah, getting back to the Enchanted area, it's I would have never guessed, that 30 or 40 years later, back then we might have seen a moose occasionally in the mid-'70s, but they weren't real common yet, and because they still hadn't done a lot of logging there. They'd done
Right.
a little bit, so once in a while we'd see a moose, but it was kind of a big deal to see one, But deep by the early 80s, and they'd done some logging up there. It already exploded. There was tons of moose up there in the early 80s. And by 2000, I was guiding moose hunters up there, So within 20 years or so after I started going up there, I was guiding moose hunters. And it's just funny. Life, you don't know what's there's just big changes. I look at a lot of the places that I went to, 40 years ago, and just how much they've changed. Sometimes, like the moose explosion was good, but then it goes back the other way, and it's ebbs and flows and ups and downs. But the biggest thing is I didn't realize, and you got to experience it too, some of the pristine, really big woods that we had up here before they got, harvested. Back when they were just cutting with chainsaws and cable skidders, the land could keep up with it. And we used to hunt, down close to wherever they were cutting with cable skidders, because that's where a lot of the feed was. But it was, you had little skid trails going into the places, and then there might be a little 4 or 5 acre cut, and then there'd be some woods again. And I took it for, granted. I thought it would always be that way.
Yeah, and a big part of that was historically, like from the time they started logging up here, late 1800s and stuff, they cut softwood. That was, between the pulp and the lumber, it was all softwood. So they never cut any hardwood, really. I don't think they cut much for hardwood unless they needed it for a special thing. But when they started, when mobile homes and campers started getting popular, like in the 60s, they started cutting yellow birch for veneer. All of those old mobile homes and stuff were, looked like paneling on them, but it was yellow birch veneer. Because I know the old timers told me that was a big thing. That was the money wood, and they don't. But when they cut that, that's all they cut. So they'd go up through the hardwoods, and they'd only cut the yellow birch veneer. And if there was probably a big spruce, they'd probably cut it. But that left the wood still nice hardwoods. It didn't grow up thick. So when I started, coming up here in 1980, that woods was still, a lot of that maple and stuff was like virgin wood. I mean, it was huge maple trees and different sizes. And the only other thing you could find them old yellow birch stumps. You could see because the grain in them is twisty. And then cedar. They must have cut every cedar that was like up in the hardwoods, them nice big straight ones. And that's what you'd see for stumps. And then, so now, if you fast forward into the 90s is when I guess the market for the hardwood really started, and then they started rebuilding them old roads back in and cutting that.
That and the logging industry changed so much because, a couple of guys with chainsaws and a cable skidder, they know what they're doing. They can cut some wood, but once they got to the mechanized logging with harvesters and fella bunches and all that stuff, I mean, you can cut so much wood so fast.
Yeah.
And the way that they cut it is just, it's changed the landscape, and we've had to adapt. But I am glad, sometimes I wish I wasn't as old as I am, but I'm glad that I'm old enough to remember some of that stuff. And my dad, he, like I said, he always took me. And then by the time I got to be a teenager, my dad had changed his whole lifestyle. And whatever he did, he made sure whether it was fixing up at a house or going hunting or going fishing, whatever, he taught me all those job skills. And one of the things that, because a lot of people ask me, I didn't want to skip over this, but this is how the whole 99 Savage thing started with me was, a lot of the guys in Big Woods Bucks and a lot of the guys that follow us, they're all into Remington pumps, which I love Remington pumps too. I'm glad I bought a bunch before the pandemic. But my dad in 1978, so I'd have been 12, that was my first rifle. Before that, the first 2 years I could hunt, when I was 10 and 11, I had a Savage 12-gauge single shot. And it would take a 3-inch slug. And I can remember when I was 10 and 11 years old, I wasn't very big. And every time I touched that thing off, because it was pretty light, and a 3-inch slug will set you back, that thing would turn me sideways every time I fired it, right? So I can remember when I was 12, I'd grown a little bit, and my dad thought that I needed a rifle, so I got a 99 Savage 308. And I can remember thinking, boy, that thing is going to pummel me, because, it was a rifle, it was high-powered.
Right.
I didn't know enough about recoil yet to know that. I remember the first time I shot that thing when I was sighting it in off the bench, I probably closed my eyes and squeezed the trigger, but I thought, boy, that wasn't too bad. It probably only kicked me about half as bad as that 12-gauge single shot, but that was my first rifle, and my dad had a lifelong love affair with the 99 Savage. I couldn't tell you over the years how many 99 Savages my dad bought and sold, but he loved a good deal, and whether it was lawn sales or pawn shops or gun shops or whatever, if he saw a 99 that was in good shape, he was going to buy it and resell it. So that's how I got hooked on 99 Savages, and it all started in 78. 78.
Yeah. My father did the same thing with me. He'd take me everywhere. I remember my father, he was a worker too, you know. That's probably how we got that work ethic. But my father always had 2 jobs. I never remember when he didn't have a side job doing something. And it was either paving driveways with a neighbor in the summer or painting. My father liked to paint. He wasn't really much of a carpenter, you know. I mean, he could pound a nail, I guess, but wasn't his big thing. But he loved to paint, and he'd have, you know, other guys he worked with, you know, he'd go paint inside their house, one room or the whole thing, whatever they wanted done. And I remember running a sash brush when I was 7, 8 years old. He'd take me with him and give me a paintbrush and said, you do this. And I had to be careful, and I just got good at it when I was young, you know. But yeah, he always had 2 gigs, and once in a while he'd have 3 gigs going on or something, you know. But yeah,
I think it's important. I've told, like, I work with a lot of young guys when I'm not running the guide business. I still cut meat for Hannaford, but whenever I'm around guys that are in their 20s and 30s, if they got young kids, I tell them, if you don't want problems with your kids when they get older, spend time with them when they're younger. And I think a lot of it too, like we said, you don't spoil your kids all the time. If you're gonna prepare them for life, you got to let them know that life is hard work. And my dad would, you know, I always had chores around the house, and my dad was, you know, I couldn't just run around the neighborhood all the time like some of my friends, happy-go-lucky. I had certain chores that I had to do.
Oh, yeah.
When I got them done, I could go off and hang with my buddies. But I'm glad too, like, I got my first job. I was 8 years old. My dad got me a paper route when I was 8. So I've had a job ever since I was 8 years old. I probably told you this story. I opened up a savings account when I was 8 years old and had one with Franklin Savings when I moved from Farmington to Skowhegan. They used to call them a passbook. Yeah. So I had that right up until I was well into my 50s. And finally one day I went in, and one of the girls at the bank said, Lee, she said, you got to get rid of that passbook. And I'm like, why? And she said, because we don't have that technology. We're way beyond that. She said, you're probably the last person in Skowhegan, Maine to have a passbook. I said, well, I've had that since I was 8 years old. I opened up an account with you guys over in Farmington. I said, I'm kind of attached to it. And she said, you're going to have to let it go.
Let it go.
Yeah. So, yeah. But
I did the same thing. I remember painting with my father young, and I remember I probably did it once, maybe more, but I can remember distinctly one weekend when he was paving driveways with a neighbor that he took me with him, and I shoveled gravel out of the dump truck for seemed like the whole weekend, and I think I got paid $2 or something for my weekend's work. And I think it was in a check, to tell you the truth. Yeah. I think I got a $2 check. And then I had to do the chores because my father was always working. And, you know, I had to mow the lawn. We always had a big lawn. And I finally got an allowance when I was about 11. And I got 50 cents a week. And I'd save my 50 cents for 2 weeks, and I'd go put it in the bank. And the same thing, I had a passbook thing. And so every 2 weeks, I'd put $1 in the bank.
The good thing about that, though, was like my buddies that never had any money, I always had all kinds of money. I ended up, not that I would encourage kids to blow all their money on baseball cards and comic books, but when I got out of high school, all those baseball cards and comic books I sold them when I got out of high school, and made a crazy amount of money on them because they're all collectible now, you know. So I took that gun and actually...
Should have saved them a little longer, really.
Yeah, I should have saved them a little longer, but I ended up, when I built my first house, a lot of that was baseball cards and comic book money.
No kidding.
Yeah. Yep, I had some really good collectible ones because, I don't know, just the way that it turned out. Then the other thing was I've always loved guns. So in 78, I got that 99 Savage, but then in 79, I got a Remington 870 12-gauge pump. My dad went down to, I don't know when Marden's opened, but they were open in 79 because my dad he bought a he got a 742 30-06 for himself and got me that 870 12 gauge and bought him for like really cheap money. And again, I always had my own money because I always had a job and I liked guns. So I'd started buying guns when I was, an early teenager. But I've told people before that all the big bucks that I've shot in my life, the only two that I've ever shot with a Remington pump, it wasn't a 760 or a 7600. It was an 870. I ended up when I was 13 years old. I went up to Cocaggio for the first time. That's back. The new store wasn't even there then. There was the old store that now they just use it for, I think, storage. It's over by the lake. It's a yellow building. And that was the original store over there. Nice. They had a wood stove in it. Imagine a general store had a wood stove in it, and guys would sit around that and swap lies. But I remember they had all kinds of photo albums and stuff there. And that's where I tagged my first deer in '79, was right there at that old Cocaggio store. And I shot that with that 870 12 gauge. And but the reason why I had that with me instead of the 99 was I'm left-handed like you, and until I started getting some 99s with the top tank safety, the safety on those 99 Savage is kind of cumbersome for a left-handed person. It's on the wrong side. So my grandfather, who was the only person before me to have a guide's license in my family, he was always a shotgun guy. He had an 870 16 gauge that he used for years to shoot deer. So, and I've told people since, if I used slugs, I might have felt better about it because we were shooting most of them, inside of 50 yards, but I was shooting those big bucks. I shot one when I was 13 up there in Cocaggio with double-aught buckshot, and luckily I was really close. I was going to shoot the doe. That's back when it was, you could shoot anything. I was walking down a trail with another guy, and this doe stood up. So I clicked the safety off that left-handed 870. I was getting ready to plow her. Well, a great big massive 8-point buck. You've seen it, really heavy horn, beautiful. It's 130 something inches, and he's really only a 6. His brow tines are only about an inch long, but big, heavy, massive 8-pointer. And I shot him with that 870 and the buckshot, and it knocked him down, but he stumbled and tried to get up, and I ran right up and was going to give him another one with buckshot, but the guy that I was with said, no, don't shoot him with that buckshot again. And he had a 99 Savage, a 300, and he shot him in the neck and finished him off. But I remember thinking that, he might have got up and run off if I didn't give him another one with that buckshot. I know in some of those southern states, a lot of guys, they use buckshot on them, but I did the same thing in my last year of high school, which would have been 84. Same thing. I shot another 200-pound buck, big 10-pointer, and it knocked him down, but he got up, and I had to shoot him again. And if I had slugs, it might have not have been a problem, but I just don't think that buckshot's got enough knockdown power for those big 200-pound bucks. They'll soak it up, and you got to keep pounding them.
Yeah.
So in '79, that was my first trip to Cocaggio. But then in '83, which would have been 4 years later, I was supposed to go to Cocaggio with my father, and we were staying in Greenville. And this is one of them stories where it's better to be lucky than good. We were going to go to Cocaggio, but it was raining pretty hard, and the guy that was supposed to go with us was sick and wasn't feeling good. And my dad said, well, we'll hunt closer to town. So it's the road that goes out to the Greenville airport, and I think they used to call it the dump road. I think they call it the Scammon Ridge Road now, but the Greenville dump was out there, and it's headed out towards Wilson Pond. And so we'd never been up there in our lives. We drove out a road, and I was in high school, and my dad was a hunter, so we knew what to look for. But we saw a hardwood ridge, and you could tell there was a few cuts up on it, and then there was some nice softwood up above it, and just looked like we just said to each other, that looks pretty nice. Let's just go up in there. So we parked the truck beside the road, got out, and we split up. We got a couple 100 yards apart and walked up towards those cuts, and we hadn't been in the woods a half an hour, and I jumped some deer, and they ran over towards my father, and I heard him shoot. So I went over and found him, and I said, "You get one?" He said, "Yeah, you ain't going to believe it." He said, I knew it was a deer, he said, but I didn't know how big it was or anything. And he said, I fired and dumped him. He said, "You ain't going to believe how big it is." So I get over there, and it was a 250-pound buck. We hadn't never hunted there in our lives, didn't know where we were going. Been in the woods like a half hour. I jumped a deer on him, and he shot a 250-pound buck, and that was in '83. It made the top 10 that year for biggest bucks in Maine. So that was the biggest deer my dad ever killed. I think he only killed 2 bucks over 200, but I was right beside him, when he shot that. And then, years later, when we started going up there on a regular basis in the 80s and 90s, I started killing big bucks pretty regular, a lot of them. And my dad was always right there to help me drag them out. I can tell some of them stories, or you want to tell a story about your hunting adventures with your dad?
Yeah. The funniest one, really, my father was he wasn't a real serious hunter, you know what I mean? I called him a putterer. He'd putter around, and he'd sit down on a stump, and he'd putter around, probably have to sit down, smoke a cigarette. He smoked his whole life. Had to get them 2 packs a day in hunting or not, Yeah. And, but the first time I talked him into going up, the first time when I decided I was coming up north here in 1980, and because that was the week vacation I could get from Hannaford, and I talked him into coming, and we got that from his cousin. We borrowed that pop-up camper with the fiberglass panels, and it was the first week, but it was cold that week. We got some snow, and then it melted, and then it froze, but it was, I can remember it was down in 10 degrees at night in the teens, and we to froze to death in there. So anyways, then I shot that one-horn spike horn there on Friday, and I went and got him to help me get it out. And but anyways, after that week, he goes, I said, "I love it up here." I said, I'm gonna start coming here every year. And he goes, "If you want me to come again, you better get some better accommodations." So I didn't have any better accommodations. So the next year, he didn't come. So I talked a buddy into going. A guy I met in the Marine Corps, his name was George. But anyways, I talked him into going. I didn't have to talk too hard, but so he came the next year. And then the year after that, my father's cousin he sold that little pop-up camper, and he bought I think it was a 19-foot holiday Rambler camper pull-around, and that was like the Taj Mahal. So my father would go again, and so I think the next year, the first year we took that, Deb went, my father and Deb and my younger brother went and had a good hunt. We shot 2 deer. My brother shot a doe, and I shot Deb's buck. That story she tells about me shooting her buck there, 7-pointer there and stuff. But
now let me ask you, was that spike horn that you were talking about? I had last week this guy from New York. His name's Jay Flannery. He runs that old school hunting page that I like to participate in. He always has lots of cool old pictures. So he private messaged me and said, "I got a picture of Hal here with he calls them 11-pointers. Yeah. He said, "You think he'd mind if I posted that on the page?" And I said, "No, I'm sure he wouldn't." But I said, you can ask him or whatever. But he posted it. Was as I remember it was hanging up on a tripod.
That was
our
game pole. We made a tripod for a game pole.
Yeah, he got quite a lot of traction. I made some comments on that. Yeah. I don't know if you did, but that was a cool little picture.
He asked me if he could post it, so I sent him a couple more pictures that he posted. The game pole with all the moose, that old-looking picture. I sent him that one, and I sent him another one. I can't remember which one it was, but I sent him a couple pictures. Yeah,
nice guy. I've got to know him quite a lot. I've talked with him on the phone.
That was the spike horn, and he had white. His back of his ears were all white, and he had white. From his knees down, it was mostly white and speckled with white. He had quite a bit of white on him, but he only had one spike. The other one it wasn't broke off. It's maybe broken velvet. Maybe it was just like a nub there on the burr, but it was a pretty big deer.
It looked at
it was a pretty big one of them, probably 140, 50-pound spikers there. But yeah, that was my first big woods buck right there, and I got hooked on it. So once we got the Holiday Rambler where we had some heat in there and stuff, he was all set to go again. And he liked to go. Like I said, he'd putter around, and he didn't hunt all day and stuff. He never got real serious, but it was fun to have him go and spend the time anyways, you know. And then he could never figure out, because he was, I think we were talking about it last night, he was one of the ones that his cup was always half empty, you know. He always saw the negative in something instead of the positive, you know.
It must have been that generation, because we had that discussion. My dad was kind of the same way too. He was a pessimist for sure, not an optimist.
Yeah. And I remember him saying to me one time, I think I was like about 14 or 15. I shot my first one when I was 12, and I shot when I was 13. So it was probably that next year when I turned 14, you know, I started talking about, you know, I was going to get a bigger buck. I was going to get a buck this time, you know, or a bigger one. I'd shot a spike horn, and he goes to me, he goes, "You can't expect to get a deer every year. Nobody gets a deer every year, so don't expect to, you know." And I said to him, "Well, I'm going to." You know what I mean? So I don't know why I was like that, but he was like just negative about that stuff. But then when he seen as time went on, I think it was almost like he couldn't believe I could shoot a deer every year, but he saw that I was doing it, you know.
It was contagious.
Yeah.
My dad was the same way. My dad, it took quite a lot to impress my father. He wasn't easily impressed, but I can remember even before I started the guide business, you know, they weren't all big bucks, but I'd shoot a buck almost every year, and a lot of them were big ones, especially once I got up in my 20s and could travel around. But I remember, like, the year after my dad shot that 250-pounder, you know, we would try to scoot away for long weekends. I don't think we did week-long trips until, like, maybe in the late 80s, but in 84, that was the year I graduated high school, we found a place up on the Anson Valley Road. It's not too far from where, like, Brandon Lane grew up there, the Lane family. They all had a farm up there on the Anson Valley Road. But there was some farm country over towards Anson, and there was some farm country back towards New Vineyard. But in the middle of that, there was a section where there was big woods. And I think it was the first place in our area that this place that we hunted, it was bucks only. They had started doing this thing where some places were designated as bucks only. I don't know if you remember that in the 80s.
I remember in 85 is when they went to the bucks only. In that year, it was bucks only. I'm sure it was everywhere. And then except you could shoot does Thanksgiving weekend, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. They did that one year.
Yeah.
And then the next year they went to that permit system. That's probably why it was bucks only in because some zones didn't have doe permits.
Yeah.
It's probably what it was.
Well, I remember I might be remembering it wrong, but I was thinking in 84, one of the reasons why I liked hunting there was there wasn't much hunting pressure because this place that we'd found up on the Anson Valley Road, it was a big piece of woods. And my father was probably one of the first, you know, guys that in our area that he loved big woods. He weren't a bit afraid of it. And again, my dad taught me how to use a compass. As soon as I was 10 years old, he expected me to know how to use a compass and be able to, you know, navigate in the woods. And, you know, he never transitioned. My dad never had a GPS or Onyx or anything, but he was really good with a compass and he could get around good.
Hi, Hal here, host of the Big Woods Bucks podcast. We're excited to announce our partnership with the most respected and recognized land company in the Northeast, Christmas and Associates Land Company. Owners Dan and Mark Christmas are two upstate New York natives with deep roots in the Adirondacks and Tug Hill Plateau, as well as two of the most passionate big woods hunters you'll meet. Whether it's newly constructed camp surrounded by state wilderness or family getaway, their team of experienced land guides are the best at matching folks with a perfect land track at an affordable price. They even provide financing. Christmas Land Guides will provide full land tours using ATVs, snowmobiles, and even snowshoes so that you can scout every acre. Christmas Land and Camp staff also help you construct the camp you've always dreamed of using our in-the-house master builders. For over 35 years, no one in New York State has provided more big buck properties and family hunting camps to hundreds of folks who love the woods than Christmas and Associates Land Company. Dan and Mark and the whole company remain dedicated to wise land conservation and treating everyone they meet like family. Always available 7 days per week unless there's fresh tracking snow. Call 800-229-7843 or visit Land and Camps on Facebook or go to landandcamps.com.
So we started hunting up on the Anson Valley Road. This is a funny story. I ended up killing my second 200-pounder that year I got out of high school when I was 18, and I shot it up on this road that probably, I don't know, when did you get to know John Fennelson, the guy that's out in Wyoming?
Oh, not till recently, in the last few years, when he got a hold of me. Yeah.
Well, I think you had told me that you'd seen on his page that he had a 760 in 300 Savage.
Yeah.
And being a Savage guy, I wanted to have a 760 in 300 Savage. So I think you gave me his number. So I called him, not knowing that he'd know who I was. And it's in Wyoming, right? So I called this guy and I said, hi, John, this is Lee Shands. Holy crap, he said, that was a big moose you shot last year. So I think it was like in 2021 that I called him, because the year before I shot that big moose that you scored for me. And I said, well, how do you know what I shot for moose? He said, I'm from Maine originally. He said, I follow you big woods guys. He said, I know what you guys shoot and where you go and everything. And so I said, well, John, what I'm calling you about is Hal had told me about you had a 760 and 300 Savage, and I'd be interested in buying that. I don't know how much you're asking for it. So he says, you can make me anything you want for an offer, Lee. He said, and you can have that gun. And I said, well, I'm sure you could probably get more for it. I said, I buy on the cheap. You could probably sell it for more money than I'm going to offer you. And he said, nope. He said, I put in for a Maine moose permit. And he said, all I'll ask from you is if I get drawn, you don't have to guide me or anything. He said, I got all the tent gear and all that. But if I get drawn, he said, I know what zones you put in for. He said, I just want you to tell me where I should set up a tent camp and where I should hunt. So I probably could have, I didn't want to, I gave him some money, but not anywhere near what it was worth. Yeah. And he said, yep, and I'll pay the shipping too. So he shipped me that gun. And the next year, Stephen went up north, up in Zone 4 and killed a really nice buck up there with it. But when I was talking with him, I said, well, whereabouts did you grow up in Maine? And he said, up in the Anson, New Vineyard area or whatever he said. I'm like, you're kidding me. I said, I grew up in New Vineyard. I said, everything in New Vineyard's named after my mother's family. I grew up on the Barker Road. That's my mother's maiden name. And he said, yeah. He said, my grandfather owned a bunch of land up on the Anson Valley Road. And I said, oh, yeah. I said, when I was a kid in high school, my last year of high school, I killed a beautiful big 10-point buck up there. And I was explaining to him, it was up near the 4 Mile Square Road and everything. He's like, he said, you probably killed that on my grandfather's land. He said, that road you're talking about, he said, my grandfather owned the land on both sides of that road, the whole length of it. And I said, well, I probably killed my second big buck on your grandfather's property then. I mean, what are the chances, huh?
Small world. Yeah. What's next?
Well, I still got plenty of stories. I'm hesitating a little bit. I don't
know
if you
talk
wanted to
too
add.
Much.
All right. So that's got us up to 84.
This is your time to talk about your dad, Lee.
So, and I appreciate it. I want you to know how much it means to me that I can share this stuff about my dad. A lot of people have asked me how I feel about, losing my dad, and I got mixed feelings about it, but in the end, I'm okay with it because he was such a wonderful father, and he just told my mother that he wasn't feeling good or whatever, and he just went and sat on the couch and passed. So, you can't ask for much more than that. But one of the things that I'm really grateful for, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, I want to try to keep stuff going, as a progression. But I was able to show him some video stuff, just before he passed that he really appreciated. But so after I got out of school in '84, I worked pounding nails for my old man for a couple of years before I started cutting meat for Hannaford. And I figure everything in life happens for a reason. And I mean, the job skills that I learned from him, while I was in high school, we were always fixing up old houses. And then I built new houses with him for a couple of years. And again, not knowing that years later that I'd be building my own houses and building my own camps. And my dad was, he wasn't just a nail pounder. There's guys out there that can pound nails and that can, build a new house as long as the material's all good and everything. But my dad taught me how to build stuff out of scrap lumber and how to build stuff with logs and build post and beam. I've done a little bit of all that stuff, and that's all stuff I learned from him. But this is another funny story. So probably like in the late 80s after I got married, we started going up there to Spencer Pond camps, and it worked out good because my mother liked going up there. So we had our own cook. We'd bring my mother with us. And so usually it was me and my dad, a couple of buddies and a couple of cousins, and we'd rent one of the big log cabins that they had, and we all would stay there. So my dad always wanted a log cabin like what you live in. He loved log cabins. But my mother loved old farmhouses, and that's, happy wife, happy life. So my father always bought these old New England style farmhouses, and, usually they were post and beam, and he'd gut them and leave the beams exposed and all of that, and he'd fix them up the way my mother wanted them. But whenever we were up there at camp, he was always telling my mother, how wonderful log cabins were and how we wanted to live in one. So my mother's idea of a log cabin, because again, these were just seasonal cabins that, they probably weren't insulated that good, and probably there'd be places where you could see daylight out through the logs, but my mother said, I think log cabins are cold and drafty. And my father said, oh, no. He said, those logs are they got insulation value in them and blah, blah, blah. So I remember we usually went up the third week of November, but for some reason we had to go up the first week. And it was one of those years, the first week, it was unusually warm and it was rainy and everything. So my father and my mother had one of the downstairs bedrooms, and then couple of my buddies and one of my cousins were in the other one, and then there was a loft upstairs. So I ended up being in the loft. So my dad got it in his head that he was going to show my mother that you could heat a log cabin, right? So I had one of them 55-gallon barrel stoves that you'd make out of a kit. Well, my dad must have put that thing chock-a-block full of wood before we went to bed, because I remember being tired. I fell asleep, and about midnight, I woke up, and it was so friggin' hot in that loft. I thought I had died. I couldn't even move. I couldn't breathe. The air was
hell, huh?
Oh my word! It was unbelievable. So I kind of like rolled out of bed. This is first week of November, and it was raining outside. It was probably, I don't know, maybe it was in the 50s. I rolled out of bed in my underwear. Didn't have anything on but my underwear, and there was a hammock out on the porch of that camp. And I was so hot, and my body temperature was so much that I went out and climbed in that hammock in my underwear outside on the porch and fell asleep. And then I probably slept for like an hour or two, and then was cold and came back inside and went up in the loft because the fire had settled down. But needless to say, my dad didn't get to tend the fire the rest of the week because I was up in that loft and I tended the fire. When we went to bed, I was the one that, tended the fire. So, but the nice thing about that, like I said, my mom went with us, so we'd be out and we'd hunt all day and just have a wonderful time up there. You know how it is when you got a bunch of guys. It increases the enjoyment when you got a bunch of buddies with you. And plus, I always liked it because my dad was a big rugged guy, and usually I'd be the only guy in camp that would shoot a buck, but my old man was always around to help me drag them out. So that was nice. And it was also nice to come back and my mother would have a nice, meal ready for us, and she had all the dishes done. It's pretty nice to have a woman in camp for that stuff.
I remember one time I went up. Was my father there that week? Yeah, he was. My father went. We had the other camp of the better one, and Deb, it was Thanksgiving week, and Deb, she didn't go out hunting that day. She was going to cook us Thanksgiving dinner. And we got back from hunting, and there was 4 of us, I think. And she's got a whole turkey and all the fixings, and she'd made 2 different pies. There's 4 of us, and 2 different pies, and we got in and started eating. Back then, that's when I could eat forever, you know?
Right.
And I sat there like a pig at a trough, and I ate, and I ate, and I packed that in, and I'd burp, and I'd eat some more. And I ate, and then shortly afterwards, we crawled in bed, right? I never slept till about 2 in the morning. My gut hurt so bad. I mean, I was laying in bed moaning. I mean, it hurt. I had so much food in there. I said, I'll never do that again, but it was some good.
You know, I look back at when you're out in the outdoors and it's cold and you've been working hard all day, food never tastes so good, huh?
Yeah.
When you come back and somebody, especially if somebody else cooked it instead of you and they're going to do the dishes afterwards, yeah, that's always good for me. The food always tastes better then. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we had those cabins up there were really nice. At the time, the guy that was running them was an old retired game warden, and he always liked me. He took a liking to me, and I'll never forget. He told me a story because when I started, I went up there, and I think I said on the podcast yesterday, I don't know how many big bucks I killed up there, but in 5 years I killed 4 that were, the smallest one weighed 233, and he was a little guy. His name was Chick Howe. He had to cheat to get in the warden service because back then you had to be 5'10" to be in the warden service. And I think he told me he was like 5'8.5". So he put lifts in his shoes and did everything else. And he's barely squeaked by. So he got in the warden service. And it was in the early 70s. And again, that was wild country where we hunted. There wasn't even a road system on the backside of Spencer Pond all the way to Moosehead Lake. There was no road system there then. There was a road that went to the outlet of Spencer Pond, and that's where they picked you up and they brought you across to those camps in a boat back when they first got them. So he told me when they first got the camps up there in the early 70s, he decided, I think it was Thanksgiving week, they had some sports in camp, but he was going to go out and hunt himself. And I remember he had an old 94, I think it was a 30-30, might have been a 32 special. It hung on the wall in camp there. It was one of those old, I call them longwoods. It's one of those pre-50s that had the long wood out on the fore end. And he told me he shot a buck out there where there was no roads, and he was a little guy. He ended up, he said, it took him, he shot it, I think, in the morning. It took him all day, and then he still didn't get it back, and he went out, and it took him all the next day to get it back to camp. And he said, never again. He said, if I see a big buck that far away from camp, he said, I just won't shoot it. And I said, well, did it ever happen again? He said, yep. A couple years later, he said, I saw a great big buck, but I was too far from camp. And he said, I let it go. I remember thinking to myself, how does anybody do that? There's no way I could do that. But yeah. That was when I first started hunting up there. There was a road in behind Spencer Pond, but there was a gate on it. And the only way that you could get back towards the lake was if you were staying at Spencer Pond camps. They gave you a key to the gate. So that country's all opened up now. Thomas Coleman manages that. Some guy that's a billionaire, owns all that land now. He owns a whole township up there at East Middlesex Canal Grant. But in the 90s, when they first started doing quite a bit of logging up there, we ended up hunting there when it was at the best of it. It was before Plum Creek owned the land around it. And at the time, I think everything was still owned by Mead Paper, which was the Rumford paper mill. And most of the cotton that they were doing was selective cotton and everything. And it was just, the deer hunting was so good. I'm sure it's like when you first came here in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
The deer hunting was just so good. And I just figured it would always be like that. But I can remember you had told me that the guy that shot the biggest buck ever when you were running the lodge down here, how you found a place that was just completely stove up with buck sign, and you said you had to have somebody sit in there and everything. Well, I found the same thing. I was out towards Eagle Mountain, up on the north end of the lake, and there was like an old skid trail that went partway down, and you could tell that there had been a wood yard there once upon a time, but years and years before. And I just kept walking down. The woods hadn't been cut there for a long time. You might see a stump once in a while, but it was basically, virgin woods. And just before I got down to the lake, I came down, I went through like this little cedar bog, and there was just a little trickle of a stream. And that's when I first discovered signpost. And I can remember seeing brown ash trees down there as big as my leg that were just shredded. And, there was one signpost down there, but there was a lot of big ash that just was demolished. And that buck had ground scrapes everywhere. And I'm not talking about little scrapes. I'm talking about those ones, that were 4 to 6 feet across and dug right down to the roots. And I'd never seen that much buck sign in my life. I think that would have been in probably 93 or 4 maybe, something like that. So I told my dad about it that night at supper time. I said, Dad, I found a place that's just stove up with buck sign. And I said, I don't want to bring the other guys down in there because they weren't as good as my dad and I in the big woods. They were used to hunting farm country and stuff. But I said, you and I need to go down there and pick and poke around. We didn't have any snow, but I said, I think one of us got a chance of shooting a big buck down there. So we got down to where that old wood yard was, and there was an old pile of trash and wood. Maybe there was some logs. I don't remember, but I just remember there was an old pile of wood there. And before I even got down to where we were going to hunt, it was probably still maybe like a half a mile away. I see this buck popped his head up behind that pile, and my father was right behind me. So I remember I'm left-handed, so I held my gun in my left hand. I put my right hand back and stopped my father so he didn't bump into me or say anything. And then I brought my right hand right over, and pow, I fired, and I hit that deer like right behind the ear, right at the base of his neck, right behind of his ear. And he dropped. And I had just seen him, just briefly. So we got over there, and I looked at it, and I was like, Dad, I think that's the biggest deer I've ever shot in my life. He said, it's a big one. He said, that might be as big as that one that I shot. So we ended up, I was going to, gut it right there and then drag it out and everything. Well, at the time, I had a short box Ford. It was more like a Bronco almost. It was a 4-wheel drive Ford pickup, but it had a short box. That thing would turn around on a dime, And even though we didn't have snow, it was cold enough, the ground was frozen, but it went through a beaver bog. The beavers had dammed up what part of that trail. And my father said, I think you can make it through there. I had some pretty good rubber on that, some good sized tires on it. So we drove all the way down in there, and I just about made it down in. The mud, I was breaking through the frost and everything. We loaded that. I never had to drag that buck. We pulled him up over that brush pile and pulled him in the back of my truck and drove up out of there. But when I came back through that old beaver bog that was in the trail there, I didn't think we were going to make it. We just about made it out of there. But I remember thinking at the time, and that was one of the first times that my father was right with me, but a couple of times my dad was like right with me when I shot some of the biggest bucks of my life. And I'll never forget. It took a lot to impress my father, but I knew there was times when my father was just like unbelievably happy for me because things worked out like that.
My father, when we used to hunt down the lodge, not up here, but relatives' lodge, one thing about my father, he could shoot, and he didn't like it. He wasn't like that he practiced or anything, but it doesn't matter if something was running down by him or whatever it was, I don't remember that he ever, like when he shot at a deer, that he ever didn't get it, But one of the times it was down there, and we used to do them little pushes down the lodge. We'd still hunt. We'd put a couple of guys out in the crossings or we thought they'd cross, like down the openings and stuff. And we had my father on this stone wall there up on the mountain, and that was down. There was like a little brook that run down out of there, and he's sitting on that wall, and somebody jumped a buck and hit. It was coming right towards my father. It must have come out of some thick stuff, but it jumped the stone wall he was sitting against, like 20 feet from him, and all he did was he threw his gun around and pow, we heard him one shot. So when we got down there, he's sitting there on the wall, and I said, that you shooting? And he goes, yeah. I said, did you get him? And he goes, I don't know. And I go, He goes, he jumped the wall right here, so I shot. I went over the wall there about 20 yards. There he was laying there dead in the doornail, shot right through the shoulder.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a pretty nice buck. But, yeah, he could shoot. But like I said, he wasn't. I don't remember that. See, I didn't learn like a lot of deer hunting expertise from my father. You know, I learned a lot from his cousin that kind of took me under his wing up there. You know, he taught me a lot of stuff there, but my father, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure he knew what a rub was and a scrape was, and that was about it. But he'd manage to scrape one up once in a while. He never did. I never remember that he ever shot. I don't know if he ever shot one over 200. Shot a few decent sized bucks, but
My dad's biggest problem was he was a really good woodsman, and like I said, he just with a compass, he wasn't afraid to strike off and do whatever. And the other thing, he was, if he heard gunshots, he could find me, which it had to be as loud as a gunshot, because my dad's biggest problem was he was deaf. My father and my uncles, my grandfather, all really hard of hearing. I think one thing that really handicapped my dad in the deer woods was he had to see him because he didn't hear anything. And I can remember he always told me, he said, Lee, because I always had good hearing, he said, take care of your hearing, when you're working on, the construction site, or if you're any place where there's a lot of noise, he said, make sure you take care of it. Because he said, I don't know, maybe I would have just lost my hearing anyway, but he always worked construction and he was really hard of hearing. But, I did the same thing with Steven. And now, as a moose guide, your most important asset is your hearing.
Yeah.
So I remember him telling me that. But I got another funny story. Like the year after I shot that 245-pound buck down there, the one that I just described, we hunted. That was down by what they call Eagle Mountain, which is right on Moosehead Lake. Well, across the road from that, and I say a road, it was just not much more than a skid trail, but you could drive down it. There was a hill. I don't even think there's a name for it, and it's not really a mountain. It's not tall enough, but it's like a series of hills, and we used to hunt over there. So we ended up the following year, we went up, and I remember it was me and my father and I think 2 cousins and a buddy. And the first morning we were in the woods, I would go up during bird season and I'd take my father by. Stephen eventually would go with us too, but my dad always loved bird hunting. So we'd go up quite often we'd go up for a week in October and hunt birds. Well, I would hunt birds, but I was also deer scouting for where I was going to, come in November. So I had found a place up on this hill across from Eagle Mountain that had a lot of, deer sign in it, and wasn't a lot of buck sign yet. It was in early October probably, but enough so that I knew there was some big bucks up there and seen some really big tracks. So the first morning that we're in the woods, I don't know. I don't think I'd been in the woods an hour, and I jumped a deer and shot this beautiful 10-point buck. It was just under 240. So my father, again, he could always find me in the woods if he heard shots. And so he comes over and he said, you think that's as big as the one you shot last year? And I said, I don't know. I don't think his horns are as good, but I said, body-wise, I said, he's going to be pretty close. He's a good one. So I gutted him out, and my father helped me drag him out. He was always, I don't know that there's anybody that I've ever been on the side of a buck with that could drag better than my old man. He was good at it. So we dragged that buck out, got him in the back of my truck. Well, after I had shot, I had heard a shot below me. Didn't know if it was one of my cousins or my buddy, but it was down below me. So I ended up, I went down and I found my older friend. I said, Milton, was that you that shot? And he said, no, it was Ricky. Ricky's got a nice buck down there. So we went down and my cousin Rick had shot a nice buck. It wasn't as big as mine, but I think the 2 bucks were actually traveling together. And when I shot mine, the other one ran down over the hill and Rick shot it. So my older friend had, he was older and had a little bit of heart trouble. Well, my cousin, they just put him on blood pressure pills. He'd gone through a divorce and, he was on high blood pressure pills. So my father and I just dragged a buck for, I don't know, hour or two. but we didn't want those guys dragging because we didn't want to have to throw one of them over our back and lug them out. So we grabbed onto that buck and dragged that one out too. So there was a same thing as a brush pile in that wood yard. And I told my father, I said, I think if I back my truck right up to that, we'll drag it right up over that brush pile and drag him into the back of the truck. So we get the deer up to the brush pile, and I said to my father, you've probably heard this story before. I said, you ready? And he said, yeah. So we gave a heave, and we pulled that buck up into the back of the truck. When we did, my father lost his balance, and when he fell, he put his hand down in that brush pile. Well, when he did, his pinky finger and his next finger to it, at that joint right there, it completely dislocated him, and it looked like he broke his fingers right off. Both of those fingers went like right completely off sideways. And my father looked at it and he said, that's going to hurt. So he flexed his fingers like that, and you could hear them. They went pop, pop. They popped right back into place. But as soon as they did, you could almost see them swelling immediately, right? So we ended up, it was just cold enough that morning. There was some ice in the mud puddles, and we grabbed a sandwich bag or something that we had in the truck, and I put that ice in that bag, and my dad put his hand in that. Well, my dad was a carpenter, and that's back, again, I don't know that my dad had a nail gun but he, pounded nails literally with a hammer most every day, and he told me that hand ached. He was right-handed. He wasn't a lefty like me, but he said that hand ached for like a year afterwards, those joints. It took about a year before all that pain to go away.
Yeah.
So we've gone up through the 80s and 90s, and so probably, it would have been in 2000. Stephen was born in 90, so in 2000, Stephen would have been 10 years old. And he ended up, my uncle had the 16 gauge side-by-side Stevens, just like that 20 gauge you got. My dad had one just like that, only it was a 16 gauge. So through the grapevine, he told my father, he said, if Stephen wants to buy that for his boy, he said, I'd sell that 16 gauge to him. So we bought that off my uncle so Stephen would have a shotgun. And as my dad got older, he liked to deer hunt, but he never got to bird hunt a lot. Like in the areas where we grew up, the partridge were so skittish down there. Unless you had a dog, they were pretty hard to hunt, because they'd flush just about out of shotgun range. So we started doing an annual trip in 2000 when Stephen was old enough to hunt. I'd drag one of my campers. I had a couple of campers that I used for the moose business, but we'd drag a camper up there by Spencer Pond, and we'd stay for a week and hunt. And my father, he loved that. There were so many birds back then, and there wasn't as many people, and we knew where to go because we'd hunted up there for a while. But so Stephen, when he's 10 years old, he's not very big, and that 16 gauge was pretty light, and it kicked pretty bad. Well, at the beginning of the week, he was hitting every bird that he shot at, So I noticed towards the end of the week, every once in a while he was missing them or whatever, and I didn't know if he was flinching or what was going on, but we had bumped into that Tom Hanrahan, the guy that started writing for the Northwood Sporting Journal there. He was staying at Spencer Pond Camps across the lake from us, so we bumped into him one day and said, hey, we got so many partridge, we can't keep up with them. We're having partridge with eggs for breakfast and partridge with our beans at night. We got all kinds of birds. If you want to come over, we'll have a big feed. So I was out, I think, cleaning the birds, and my father had started cooking or whatever, and Tom was talking to my son. He always loved Stephen. I remember for Stephen's, his wedding gift, he gave him a Larry Benoit knife. So that's what Stephen got for a wedding gift from Tom. But Tom was talking with Stephen, and I don't know if he pointed it out or my father saw it or whatever, but Stephen had a short sleeve shirt on, but it came down almost to his elbows. But one of them noticed his arm. So when I came back in, my father said, have you seen Stephen's arm lately? And I'm like, no, what's the matter with it? And he said, he's black and blue from his shoulder clear to his elbow. So his arms were so skinny and stuff, he didn't have any padding. So we lifted it up, and his arm was just purple. It was towards the end of the week, and he'd probably shot a box of shells through that. So Tom, I think it was in the Northwood Sporting Journal, a picture of it, but I remember he wrote the article and talked about it, but I think he put a picture. But yeah, Stephen had shot so many birds and shot so many shells that his arm was purple from that. And we continued that tradition even after I started the guide business. Of course, Stephen went off to the Marine Corps, but in December, after muzzleloading season was gone and everything, we'd combine, we'd go up and hunt birds, and we'd also look for sheds. Quite often we'd find a few moose sheds. We'd always go up Christmas week, and I was really glad that Stephen ended up just maybe like a week or so before my dad died. It was just before deer season started. My father had never seen the bear business that we bought. My father hadn't been up and seen our bait sites in the country just below Moxie and places where we hunt. So he said to Stephen, he said, I'd like to, go up there with you and I'll hunt birds. And Stephen was, picking up his barrels and, just cleaning up around the sites. You know how that goes. So they went, and Stephen had his two boys, my grandsons. And my father, again, he was already deaf by then, and he was starting to lose his eyesight too, but Stephen was finding birds up in trees and pointing them out to my father. I don't know if you saw the video, but I think he posted it on Big Woods, but he posted on Shan's guide service. He'd say, Grandpa, it's right there. And my father's like, I can't see it. And he's like, it's right up there in that spruce tree out on that second limb up or whatever. And so my father would shoot, and then Stephen's boys would cheer him on. And it meant so much to Stephen, that he had one last time with his grandfather, like a week before he died.
Yeah.
He took him up and got to spend that, because you never know when it's going to be the last time, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We sometimes, like we said, you take your parents and family for granted, and you just assume they'll always be around, and that happens. Same way with my father. He just, he didn't, like I said, he smoked, and that had caused him to have the heart attack when he was 65, and he was still in good shape even when he was older. I mean, as far as he quit smoking after that, but I mean, he still did everything. He spoiled Gary, because he wouldn't, like, Gary was supposed to mow the lawns, and so my father would go mow the lawns before Gary got out of school, so he didn't have to do it, But he was always catering to the guests and stuff down there, and then that right out of the blue there he got that pancreatic cancer, and that was the end. He didn't last long enough to do anything with him. The only thing we did with him was he was up for the summer, and then they found out that's what he had. My mother found out in September. And then he probably came up bird hunting because he still was okay, And then my brother brought him up for 1 day, 1 or 2 days probably, and got him out deer hunting. He was starting to lose weight already, And then, because I was guiding, I couldn't do a lot. And then that was the year I remember. It was the last day. I'd gone down and seen him, I think, on a Sunday. And then it was the last day of deer season, I remember. And I was, it was rifle season. I'm sure it was rifle season. And somehow probably my hunter went home, after Friday, or maybe he'd shot a deer. I can't remember, but I picked this buck track up on the mountain there, and was going around on. I hadn't been on it a real long time, and he got in picked up a doe and started following this doe, and they were right kind of going over the top, and they had cut up there, I don't know, 10, 15 years before, so it was that thick spruce on the top, but there was them aisleways down the skid roads that are nice, And he was going down, they both were going down, and it started to pitch over, and I remember it was windy, and the trees were blowing a little bit, and then I heard this noise, and I said, it must be a tree creaking or something. Well, I heard it again. I go, I think that's a buck grunting, and I'm looking and looking down over where I heard it, and it was real thick. It went over, and there's a real kind of a thick patch down in there, and I could see him down in there. It was a buck and a doe, and the track was one of them big tracks. I knew it was over 200, but I couldn't see a lot of antlers. I said, geez, it don't really seem like he's got much of a rack, and so I kind of waited, and they were just screwing around, and she was feeding. Ended up watching him breed that doe twice. I mean, I think I watched them 15, 20 minutes. And then finally she started working her way back up, like getting out of the brush. And I was sitting, I had sat down just to wait, I was sitting there, and she had crossed the skid road I'm on, come out of the brush and went across. I'm like, well, there, now he's coming. So I'm sitting there like this, and I'm ready. And I can see him coming up through the brush. And he steps out into the skid trail, and he looks up it towards me, and he's only got one antler. The other one's like broke off by the brow point there. And the one side was pretty good, just, average, but decent, And I'm looking at that, and I'm like, everything's going through my mind, with my father and stuff. And I'm like, I wouldn't have that mounted with one that was, if it was grown that way, it might have been different, but I could see it was broke. He's only about 40 yards from me. And I said, I ain't going to shoot your old boy. Go ahead. And he wandered off with the doe there, and I got out of there and went home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember, it's funny how I think a lot of people, and this is one thing that I've always appreciated about you, Hal, and the other guys in Big Woods, people think that we're a bunch of killers. And I think that's one reason why people get sick of some of those TV shows where it's just about, watching a grain feeder or whatever. And I'm not bad-mouthing anybody, but it's not really about the experience. It's about people just killing something with big antlers. But like, I've had times when I could have shot something, whether it was a deer or a moose or whatever, and just decided not to because it didn't feel right to me. I wasn't going to be happy about it, so why would I? And I can remember having the conversation with you because you and I have never done stuff the easy way. Almost everything we did was hard work, right? Everything that we do was hard work. Yeah. And I can remember talking about how, I've never driven down a road and got out. I know guys that have shot 250-pound bucks just driving down a road and seen a buck out there. And I was like, that's never happened to me. And I guess I really never gave that much thought to it. But the first time that I said something to you about like that, you said, I wouldn't shoot him. I might let him run off if there was snow on the ground. I might let him run off and give him a while and then get on the track and shoot him. But I ain't going to just jump out of my truck and shoot a buck beside the road. I don't think a lot of people understand that. To them, they'd have to shoot that buck so that they can impress their buddies or whatever. Yeah. But they'd rob themselves of the experience, right?
Yeah. Well, people hunt for different reasons, I guess. And I understand, when you're first starting out and hunting and stuff, you want to shoot some deer and stuff. And I get it, but I wrote an article one time. I titled it "The Evolution of a Deer Hunter," and it's how because I went through it. I think everybody does. Well, some people never do. Some people never grow out of the ways of the beginning, but I think most people eventually graduate through, whether it's, they've shot enough bucks and now they want to shoot a bigger one or whatever it is, but you do evolve that way. And like for me, you're the same way. It ain't that hard to shoot a buck, it really ain't that hard. So we try to get a bigger one, and the old big ones are the ones that are hardest to get. So that's why I kind of focus on that. I don't need to shoot a buck any particular year. Like last year, I had so much fun going with Ryland, and I ended up seeing three bucks that I would have shot, and one with Billy there, I just had a brain fart and didn't pull a gun up because I would have shot that one. But the two with Ryland, I watched get away, and I'm like, I was hoping he'd shoot, but he never did, and they were pretty much chip shots for me, but that was just fun just to see him, And
I remember the one after you posted that one when you were with Billy and you were like, I don't know what I was thinking. You and I have guided people for so long that we're not even, you probably forgot you had a gun in your hand.
I did.
Yeah.
You know what I was thinking about after they bound it off? I'm like, first thing I thought of was, geez, I should have got the camera out. And then I'm like, I should have shot that because I didn't even think about my gun. I was thinking about it'd been nice footage, you know.
Well, how many times in the last 25 years, and for you, more like 35, but we've guided people, and a lot of times weren't even carrying a gun, and just seen a buck of a lifetime get shot at and missed, and maybe repeatedly shot at and missed.
Yeah.
So I don't think a lot of people, sometimes people ask me, you know, you got these guys on Facebook or social media, and some guys just want to measure everything, right? And they want to know how many bucks you've killed so they can tell you how many they've killed and stuff. And I don't like to engage with people like that, but I remember thinking to myself, well, no matter how many that I have killed, I probably could have killed 5 times as many if I wasn't dragging somebody along with me. But the trade-off is I've made a living my last 25 years of my life instead of being at a job that I hated, which I grew to hate my other job I had when I was a boss and was in charge of all those people. I hated that job. My last 25 years of my life, I've loved every minute of it. You know, it's not many people get to, I was a good athlete in high school, but nowhere near good enough to make a living at it. You know, I was never going to be a football player or a baseball player or whatever.
Yeah.
And really the closest thing that I was ever going to get to it was being a guide. And so I try every once in a while to remind myself that, you know, it's too bad the clients miss them or they don't see them or whatever, but I'm a way better hunter because I'm a guide. You know, you learn so much more.
Plus, the other thing about that is it's that many more experiences we've had, you know, just to see those. How many people get to see as many? I can't even tell you how many big bucks I've seen in my life, guiding and, you know, by myself and stuff. You know, you can't even fathom it, really. Yeah. Like I say,
it's incredible.
I tell people, if I had all the bucks I watched get away from clients over the years, make my walls look sick, you know. Yeah. But it's in here. I still have it here, you know. I remember them all and what happened and stuff.
But that's another thing, though, too, is like when we started Big Woods Bucks at least 20 years ago, a little over 20, I think, our mission was that we wanted to educate and entertain, and guiding's the same way. I've had people that came, and they came one year, they watch these TV shows and they think it's going to be instant gratification. They see all the big bucks that you and I have shot or some of our clients have shot. So they think they're going to, but if they come up and they see how hard it is and how much work it is in the woods that we hunt, for some people it's one and done. They ain't coming back. But I've got probably a half a dozen guys that came with me years ago not knowing what they were getting into, and now it's part of their life. And, you know, the friendships that we've gotten and the people that we've helped. I've guided people that, you know, I don't guide them anymore because I taught them for 4 or 5 years and now they do it on their own. And I'm sure that someday, you know, even if they've never voiced that to us now, someday they're going to say, you know what? I was thinking about it the other day. My path that I got on and that I live my life by now, you know, you started that 25 years ago, whatever. Yeah. That's bound to come back. Anyway, getting back, one other thing that I wanted to touch on with my dad, because it does come back around to Big Woods Bucks, is besides teaching me how to navigate in the woods, I don't know if I told you this, but when I spoke at my dad's funeral, I've got a brass compass, and I had it on my little wool vest that I was wearing, but my dad gave me a brass compass when I was 10 years old, and I talked about how he taught me to navigate with that brass compass. And I always used to keep one of those silver compasses in my pocket too, in case I lost it or something. I always kept a second one, but I've had that brass compass now for 45 years or whatever it is, and how it's through my guiding life, my personal hunting life and everything, I depend on that, and it's something that my dad instilled in me. But he taught me how to navigate through life in so many ways, work ethic, all my other skills. But one of the things that I was really grateful for, hopefully I can get through this one, but my dad wasn't a picture taker or a filmer. He shot that 250-pound buck, and I was telling Paul or Scott earlier, we don't even have a picture. My dad shot a 250-pound buck and never even took a picture of it.
Yeah.
So, but in 2007, it was 18 years ago, I bought Bean Pond Camps. And I found out about it through a guy that had retired, and it had never been owned by one person. It was always owned by a group of people. And there were 6 guys that owned it, and 3 of them got squabbling. So the 3 guys that ended up with it were all retirement age, and one of them was that Grant that you knew from down Scarborough way. And so I brought my dad up there and showed my father Bean Pond Camps. And at the time, there was the main cabin and a couple of outbuildings. Well, I've made the outbuildings into cabins as well, so I've got 3 cabins up there now. But the original cabin was a 100-year-old log cabin that was basically pretty good shape, but it was sat down in the mud, and the sill logs and everything were all rotten and needed to be jacked up and fixed. But it had a metal roof on it, and for the most part, it was solid enough. I figured I could do something with it. I was never afraid of fixing stuff up because I've been doing it my whole life. So I brought my dad up there and showed it to him, and he said, well, do you have the money? And I said, well, I got about half the money. And he said, I'll give you the other half you can borrow the other half from me and then just sell one of your camps down there in Cornville, pay me back or whatever. So my dad helped me buy the Bean Pond Camps, and he was pretty close to retirement age when I bought him. Not quite. He was still working some, but he would take at least 2 or 3 days off every week because he loved it up there. And he went up, and so we completely restored that 100-year-old log cabin. And I'm sure it's better shape now than it was when they built it, because I jacked it up and put all cedar underpinning, all the floor joists and everything. It's all cedar logs, and I jacked it up in the air enough so that there's air going under it, and it's never going to rot again, because I ended up digging, post holes and filled them with granite. The place is full of granite up there. So now all those cabins are sitting on granite. And so my dad helped me do all of that stuff. And there's no way to get equipment over there. So like when I was putting roofs on some of those, my father or my son or somebody would steady a step ladder, and I'd put a spruce log on my shoulder that might weigh, 300 pounds, and I'd put one end on my shoulder and climb up and put it up on the roof and spike it in place, and then bring the step ladder over and do the same thing on the other side. And I think about some of the work that I did over there, and, Dad helped me do all that stuff. And I'm glad I don't have to go back and do that again. My back aches now just thinking about it. But probably, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, Chris had talked with me about it, and I told him I was going to put an addition on the Bean Pond Camp, and that I was going to go up in the wintertime and film myself. I got all the logs out with a snowmobile, I own 1,000 feet of frontage on the pond, and it's all spruce on one end and fir, and it's all cedar on the south end. So I went up there, and I didn't cut any trees, close to the water or anything, but I would cut the trees, and then I would skid them down to the pond, and the pond was froze over, and I'd skid them up the length of the pond, and then I had a little log landing there by the camp. And so I filmed myself doing that, and Bruce, my friend, went up and filmed me there 1 or 2 days. So I called it redneck logging. I'd cut those trees down, and if they got hung up, I might put something for a shiv in a tree beside it and hook my old 440 Scandic to it, and I'd get them down and pulled them out. Then I peeled all the logs that spring, and then Stephen and Dad, when I first started, I wanted a couple of guys there to get me started, and they came up and helped me get the thing off the ground. Well, anyway, I filmed the whole thing. Whoever edited it, they did a good job, and so we made like a little 4-part series. I think the clips are 15 minutes, and so it takes about an hour to watch it. And I thought it came out really nice. The addition came out nice. I self-filmed myself. Most of it, I I would just put my camera on my step ladder and film myself doing it. And the editor, like I said, did a good job fixing it. Well, probably, I don't know, a couple months before my dad passed, I had him over to the house because my parents don't even have a computer, and they're not on the internet or Facebook or anything. So I had him come over to the house one Sunday after church for dinner, and we hooked it up to the big screen TV, and I got to show my dad the footage of that. And then I dedicated it to him, at the end, and told him, how grateful I was that he taught me all that stuff. So, yeah, like a couple months before he died, my dad got to see that, and he's gone. So you'll have to talk for a while. So I got one more story I want to tell, but it's just, I was glad I got to share that.
Yeah. You had him over in a timely fashion there to. Yeah.
Don't put it off.
Right.
Don't put it off because you don't know when it's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
I will say one thing. I can't remember when your dad passed, but I remember thinking I would have loved your dad too, but I kind of got robbed. He died so young. It was kind of too bad. He got the cancer, and I would have loved to meet him.
He passed away before we started filming, so I really don't have any, have him on film at all doing anything. But and the thing is people like that, your father and my father, I think they're probably the same in that everybody liked them, I don't think, I know my father, there wasn't anybody that didn't like him, And it was amazing at his funeral how many people, a bunch of people came down from Jackman, because it was down, the funeral was in Portland, came down, people he'd met up here, because he spent a lot of time after he retired. He was pretty much for, the last 5 years, he spent more time up here. We had given him the trailer. We had a mobile home down in Harpswell. When we moved up, we moved that up there for him, put it in the trailer park, and my mother didn't like it up here that much. She'd come up once in a while, but my father loved it here, but he got to know everybody around town, and then quite a few of my clients that had met him over the years had come up from Massachusetts or whatever to the funeral, So, yeah, they left, they left an impression on a lot of people.
Yeah,
especially us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last little story, and then we can close it up. But again, I figure that everything happens for a reason. But when my dad passed, I was actually guiding somebody, and you've met Adam Tolman. He follows Big Woods. And, Adam had broken his ankle, so it was kind of hard for me I would go with him. But Adam's been, with me. It's kind of like a semi-guided thing. A lot of times when I'm guiding him, he lets me carry a gun, and I'm not usually always right with him. Sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not, depending on if we're on a track or whatever. But because he had a busted ankle, he couldn't go very far this year. So, before the season, I'd scouted some areas where, we'd either killed bucks before, or I knew there would be plenty of buck sign. And so I remember we were out in Wellington, and it's where I've killed, 3 bucks out there in the last 4 years, all good ones. And Logan killed a buck out there, and Joe, but we've done really good anyway. So we get down into this. It was at an edge of a cut that's a few years old and had plenty of feed in it. And Adam didn't get to see him because I didn't drag him. The cut was pretty nasty, but on the other side of it, there was a signpost and a bunch of rubs over there. So I could get him up on this little knob, and so he could see in one side of that cut. And then I went to the next knob over, and we would have been able to hear each other, but couldn't quite see each other. And so I was rattling and grunting, trying to see if I could get something to come out. And so my phone went off in my pocket, and I had it shut off, but it vibrated. So I looked, and it was my mother. And this was on Veterans Day, so it would have been the 11th, right? Veterans Day is always the 11th, I think. So I said, well, she should know I'm guiding. I said, she probably just forgetting. So I put it back in my pocket, and then it vibrated again, and I saw it was my wife. And my first thought was, boy, I hope something didn't happen to one of the kids or something, you know. So I answered it, and my wife said, your mom just tried to get a hold of you. And I'm like, yeah, but I said, I'm guiding. I said, Adam's right here. And I said, I've been trying to call. And I said, what's up? And she said, your mom thinks that your dad has passed. So, you know, it was like a shock. I didn't even know what to say. She said, you need to come home. They're gonna, you know, she called the ambulance and everything, but you need to come home. So I packed up all my stuff and I went over, and Adam there's with me. And I've tried to be like I'm not old enough to be his father, but, you know, I'm old enough to be an older big brother, right? So I've just always tried to be a good example to Adam. He had a rough childhood. And again, when I think about some of my clients and the upbringing that they had and the stuff that they went through, makes me appreciate my life that much more. So I went over to Adam and I was like, Adam, we got to go. And he's like, what's the matter? And he said, I don't know for sure, but I said, I think my father might have just passed away. I got a call from my mother and then one from my wife. So I said, we got to go. Oh, Adam, you know, he didn't know what to say. He said, I'm sorry, Lee. He said, yeah, we'll get right out of here. So we ended up, I got him home, left him at camp, you know, and Kelly had made some stuff for him to eat. So we went over, and sure enough, my dad had passed. And again, I had mixed feelings about it. I was surprised because I wasn't ready for it to happen, but it happened. He just sat down on the couch and passed, you know. He's 78 years old, and my family, we're all believers, you know, and I have a great relationship with my mother and my sister and, you know, all the kids and everything. Everybody showed up at my mother's house, and it was sad because we're not going to see my dad for a while, but there was hope. We were just grateful for the life that he had and what a wonderful father and grandfather he was. So it was the same thing with like the people that came to my father's funeral, like Chris came to the funeral, and him and some other people, because a lot of people don't know I sing. Yeah. You've heard me sing, but a lot of people have never heard me sing. And so I sang at my dad's funeral, and everybody, the first time they hear me, they're always surprised because I'm such a redneck hillbilly. I think they think, you know, I can barely talk, but I can sing, right?
Yeah.
So I think it just, my brother-in-law spoke, and my brother-in-law, my father, actually, my brother-in-law is lucky. My sister's a beautiful girl and probably out of my brother-in-law's league, but my father-in-law, he'd tell you that too. My father loved my brother-in-law because he was my friend growing up, and Dennis was just a nice kid, respectful, hard worker and everything. So he was always telling my sister, you know, Dennis would make a good boyfriend or whatever. And I don't know. Eventually they did. They went on a date. Now they've been married for, 40 years and got 4 kids together. But he spoke, and Dennis is a good speaker. And then we had our pastor, spoke, and he loved my father. And his hunting rifle is a 99 Savage that my father picked up for him, and so it just was a wonderful service. And it wasn't like it was sad. I mean, people were sad that my dad was gone, but the place was full of people that loved my father and was just grateful for the impression that, that he'd made on him. And I felt really good about that. It was great. But getting back to Adam, so when I get back, I go over and, Kelly goes back to the house, and I go over to, he's staying at the lodge across the road from, the house. And so he said, you're probably not going to want to go out the rest of the week. And I'm like, no, I'm fine, Adam. I said, my father, would want me to do, this is what I was born to do. My father helped me. My father helped me build all these camps. He's the one that taught me how to hunt, how to do all this stuff. And I said, I'm sad that my dad's gone, but I have hope, and my father would want me to take you out hunting tomorrow. So we hunted a couple more days, and I think maybe it was probably the beginning of the next week. Again, Adam couldn't get off the road too awful far. We were maybe quarter of a mile in the woods. I'd walked him up a skid trail and then up this little brook. It's in an old nasty cut. You've been out there and hunted out there once. And so I got him into a place where there was just a run going down through there, and it was just beat up with deer tracks and a bunch of rubs and scrapes and everything. So I put him on a place where he could see really good. And then I went to the next knob up, and again, I was rattling and grunting. Well, we hadn't been there like a half hour, and I rattled in 2 bucks. I'd never done that before. I've rattled in bucks like maybe 3 years before. I rattled in a nice buck that I killed, but I'd never rattled in 2 at once. And it was almost like, I don't know, it was meant to be. One of them came up in front of me, and one of them, they split when they got up in that cut. One of them went down towards Adam, and one went down towards me, and Adam saw his. It went down that skid trail that he was watching, but, it all happened quick, and he didn't get a shot off. Well, I knew what was going to happen, so I didn't get to film. I'm going to give Scott a bunch of the footage I filmed, before and after, so I've got some footage, but I don't have the kill shot because I was, by myself. But I ended up shooting. It was 186 pound. It was funny. He was only 6 point. He had pretty good sized tall rack, but only 6 points. Kind of like those Jackman deer. There, sometimes those old deer, that's all they're ever going to be is a 6. Yeah. But I remember after I shot it, because Adam's with me before. I shot a big 10-pointer in there 2 years before, and again, I'd just split up from Adam, and I had my daughter with me. And when he hears me shoot, he assumes something's going to be dead, right? So I'm trying to film everything after I had just filmed, before I rattled him in and showed a bunch of buck sign and everything. Well, then after I shot, I was going to give the deer, because I'd shot down through some whippies and everything, but it wasn't too far away. I was pretty sure I probably had hit him, but he'd disappeared, and, I was going to give him a few minutes and then go down and get on the track. Well, he's coming unglued down there because he's seen a buck, but he ain't in any shape to chase it, right? Because he's literally has a busted ankle. So he's texting me, and I see it, and then I just put it back in my pocket. And so I'm trying to film. When I go down where I shot at the deer, I'm filming like the shooting lane that I did. And then when I'm walking down there, I come across 2 great big ground scrapes, and so I film that. And then I get down and I see he had big feet on him. If you'd have seen that track, you'd have thought for sure that he'd been over 200. He had a really big foot on him. So I filmed that, and then it took me a little while to find blood, and I found a drop of blood. I had marked where I'd last seen him. So I find a drop of blood, and I film that. And then anyway, I get up to the deer, but my phone's blowing up in my pocket because Adam, he just wants to know what's going on, right? So I texted him back. You don't have enough service to make a call there, but you can text. So I texted him back. I said, Adam, I want you to just stay put because there was 2 bucks. So I do my film, and then he wants to film me with the buck and everything, and it worked out good that he was there. So he comes up and, he films me with the deer, and then he films me. I put it in a jet sled because it was no snow on the ground. So I put it in the jet sled, and I'm dragging it through this miserable cut that's all blowdowns and everything else. And so Adam just felt like, he was part of it. And he's one of those guys, he's followed Big Woods for years, and he wants to shoot a Big Woods buck so bad he can taste it. And he's been with me, I think in the last 4 years, those 3 bucks that I killed over there, I think he's been with me with every one of them, 2 of them for sure, and maybe the third one, I can't remember. But he just wants to be part of it, And then I think I was a good example to him, or I gave him hope. It was nice for him to see that, I'd lost my dad, but had nothing but fond memories of him. And I was still grieving, but I was doing the things that my father loved to do, that I loved to do. And then, a couple weeks later, Adam, he drove all the way. He'd gone back to Vermont because one of his kids was having an issue. So I told him, I said, well, you better go back and get that taken care of. I said, I'll pray for you that, everything's all right with your kid. And it ended up all it was. They were worried he might have some kind of a neurological disorder, and they think now it was just he needed glasses. His eyes were so bad he needed glasses. But anyway, he drove all the way from Vermont to come to my dad's funeral, and he got to meet all these people, and he said, your dad was a great man. And I said, yeah, Adam, he was.
For sure he was. Yeah. Well, he's waiting upstairs for you. We'll all get together again someday. We're just here temporarily anyway.
Life is but a vapor that appears for a short time and then vanishes away.
Yep. We make
Sorry, I got kind of emotional. I thought I kept it together pretty good.
Did good.
Yeah, it's
better than I would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am grateful for everything.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful too. I know I tell you this all the time, Hal, but I do. I think of you as a big brother, and I think about how years ago it was all that article that started it. You know, somebody wrote an article about me, and you and I have been best friends ever since.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful thing.
You're like my little brother.
Yeah. I'm bigger than you, but I'm your little brother.
Yeah. Well, that's good. You got dedication into your dad and told some good stories, and
It was a little personal, but hopefully people like it and be able to relate. I guess one last thing that I would add is if your dad's still alive, don't take it for granted. And even if he, maybe is past his prime, if he wants to go bird hunting or go trout fishing, take him.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. I did that with my grandfather. I spent a lot of time with him, and he had a good long life, and he passed away in his rocking chair at 98, But I used to spend a lot of time with him. Even I didn't live too far from him before I moved north, and when I first got out of the Marine Corps, and me and Deb would go down there and play cribbage and stuff, cards with my grandparents, and my grandfather would always want to hear the deer stories from up north. He came up here fishing, but he never came up deer hunting here, and he wasn't a big deer hunter either. But yeah, everybody's gonna pass away sometime and go over the gate. That's it. We'll catch up. All right, we better sign off.
Yeah.
This is a good one.
I hope so. I don't know how long it was, but
Doesn't matter.
it's all good.
It's all good. All right, everyone. Well, that was special, and we'll just sign off regularly, like saying, just support the sponsors and subscribe if you haven't, and life is good. So until next time, good luck on the trail.